Hello, welcome along. A humanist and a Christian today are responding to young people's questions about God here on Unbelievable. David Robertson is a church leader and founder of the Solus Centre for Public Christianity. His latest book, ASK, Real World Questions, Real World Answers, tackles over 50 questions submitted by young people. Also on the show today is Hannah Timson, the Emeritus President of Humanist Students UK. Hannah grew up in a Christian family but lost her faith. She'll be engaging with David today on the questions that young people ask, and we'll be hearing from some young people themselves across the course of the show. I don't know if you still count as a young person, Hannah. Probably in my book, but anyway,
definitely in mine.
I took a few quick interviews with children and young people down at my own church, and we're going to be firing some of their questions at David and Hannah across the course of today's show. So if you want to engage more on the questions that young people are asking, there's actually a dedicated seminar stream at this year's Unbelievable conference on the 20th of July. Reaching Young People. It's led by Ruth Jackson from Premier Youth and Children's Work magazine, along with Emily Howarth and Tim Alford of Limitless, Elim Church's National Youth Ministry. So do book in and take advantage of the student discount too, if that's you. The website, as ever, for that is premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable conference. But for now, welcome back to the show, David and Hannah. Great to have you both with me today. David, it's been a little while since you were on, I think a year and a half.
It has. People were beginning to wonder if I'd been banned.
I know. No one gets banned on Unbelievable. In fact, you're about to experience quite a new challenge and adventure because you're off to Australia.
I am in 2 weeks' time.
Gosh.
So heading off to Sydney, but covering the whole of Australia. So after 27 years of being in St. Peter's in Dundee, my last Sunday was last Sunday, and all very emotional.
Well, all the very best for this new endeavour. I
you.
understand you're going to be sort of starting some new initiatives out there with City Bible Forum and doing some exciting kind of cross-cultural, secular culture, church kind of interaction stuff.
Yeah, it's doing this kind of thing with young people. In fact, many of the questions did come from Australia, but with young people, but also with older people as well, because as you know, the dialogue stuff is what I like.
Well, being on Australia doesn't stop you from contributing to the show, I can assure you. We
I believe they have the internet there as well.
They do, as I understand it.
Actually, you have a lot of listeners down there, because I was going around and people were saying, "Oh, I've heard you on Unbelievable."
Well, there you go. Maybe we'll have sorted out Brexit by the time you return as well. But
miracles
do happen.
I could have sorted that for you, but no, nobody's listening to me. So.
Hannah, welcome back to the show. It's been over a year since you were on the show as well for the first time. That was, I think, with Sharon Dirks talking about the problem of suffering. But so a year on, how's things going? You're no longer president, you're emeritus president now of Humanist Students.
Quite a grand name, isn't it?
It does. It makes me think of basically very old men who have retired from academia.
Well, that's me.
But
now,
that's not quite the image I have of you.
Yeah.
So what are you doing with your time at the moment?
I've actually just set up a singing business. I think it's part of the idea as a humanist that actually you make your own purpose in life. I kind of spent a long time thinking about what I want to do and what it is that I want to bring to the world. And for me, it took me a long time to realise that music was something that, for want of a better word, is a gift. And that actually...
It's a good word.
David approves of that word.
I would say from whom, but we won't go there.
And that it brings a lot of joy to people. And so after a lot of thought, I thought, actually, this is something to set up. But I'm getting involved in a lot more as I'm coming to the end of my emeritus presidency. I'm getting a lot more involved with Humanist UK and helping to set up our dialogue strategy, which again is something I'm very passionate about. And then I'm going back to university in September to do sociology masters.
Great.
Yeah,
exciting times. Just to remind those who don't recall your story, you did grow up in quite a sort of Christian family.
I did.
And would have described yourself as a Christian for a good number of your teenage years and so on.
Yeah.
Can you remind us what kind of led you ultimately to decide, actually, no, I've rethought this and I don't believe it anymore?
I think it was a long process. I think I would say I probably believed in God until I was at least 19 or so. And I think it was around 16, 17 when I started to question my faith. I think that's the time you kind of begin to question a lot of things. And I'd grown up in a family that was very dedicated to Christianity and to their faith. And again, as I'm very musical, I love the musical aspect of church and love being involved in worship and things like that. And I think that ultimately is what kept me from questioning a lot of the things until I was slightly older. And then I started to question, I think I got a boyfriend maybe when I was about 17, my first sort of proper boyfriend, and he happened to be an atheist, much to my mum's delight. But throughout our relationship, I maintained my Christian faith, and actually it was ultimately what ended the relationship somewhat, because he believed that Christians were stupid, and there is a narrative. Sometimes there is that narrative, and I don't agree with that now, and I didn't agree with that then, and that made me very angry, because we used to have a lot of debates about stuff like that. It did ultimately open up a whole plethora of questions that I'd never really questioned within my own community. And then I went to live with Amish people, and that kind of was ultimately what ended it.
This is a very interesting period in which you kind of engaged in this sort of reality TV show, and that itself kind of, again, ignited a whole set of questions when you visited this very different culture, which you kind of found quite alien and weird in some ways. But that's a big story, and we won't have time to really dig into it. Nonetheless, the point being, your story is perhaps not untypical of many young people who maybe grow up in a Christian family, but in a sort of secular culture, lots of questions and doubts, skepticism arise, and don't always find satisfactory answers, basically, to those questions. And I'm sure this is a lot of, by and large in this book, ASK, David, it feels like the young people who have submitted these questions are Christians, but with some serious questions and doubts. And perhaps maybe this is aimed at Christians who are perhaps in that position Hannah was at the sort of 16, 17, 18-year-old, not sure whether this does make sense, and questioning whether they're going to actually adopt this for the long term.
If the book works, so I'm always an optimist. So I conceived of it as a trilogy, because I've got a bit fed up of what I would call apologetic books, and especially for young people that say, here's the question, here's the answer. And I always think, no, there's not. All these questions are so deep, you could spend all of your life thinking about them. So for me to put something and say, here's your answer, I've always been frustrated that I didn't want to do other people. So my idea was that ASK is deliberate. Ask, seek, knock, from the words of Jesus. So the ask, you're right, is for those who are growing up, not necessarily Christians, but within a church environment, and they've got lots of questions. They go to youth groups, they do exactly what you did. There's a certain predisposition towards, okay, we've got the Bible, so it's answering questions from the Bible. The seek one will hopefully be for young humanists who people who say, oh, come on, none of this is true, and they've still got questions. Okay. So my story is different from Hannah's, because it was questioning that caused me to become a Christian rather than the other way around. And then the knock, if they work, what I'd like to do with the knock is, this is really people who are desperate, people who are struggling with lots of really deep personal issues. So I just thought, well, we'll see how it works. So you're right. You're very perceptive, Justin. This was deliberately done for those who have some acquaintance with the church, who are growing up in a Christian home. If the church had retained its young people over the past 30 or 40 years, we'd be 10 times the size we are now.
That's an interesting point. Yeah. And I think there are statistics out there about the fact that, if you like, if a church can reach a young person at a certain age, they're far more likely to, as it were, retain that. It's much harder in a sense to draw someone back in once they've gone out of the church context in that way.
Well, yes, and I think churches have been quite defensive. I don't know your own experience, but churches tend to close ranks and say, let's keep people out, or they've been quite trite. Whereas my view is, between the ages of about, 9 to 16, 17, that's when most people are most active in thinking about things. I think you go to university, you kind of stop thinking. No, maybe.
Maybe not.
No, well, I don't know. I'm becoming a wee bit cynical, but certainly when you leave university and stuff, people, don't bother me with, the deep questions. But I do. I mean, I often say this, that the hardest questions I've received, and I've been interviewed by experts like you, Justin, by people from the Times, the Financial Times, the BBC. I've never received harder questions than from 12-year-old kids from our housing estates. So I think we underestimate the ability of our young people to think for themselves. I'm also a little bit, I mean, maybe Hannah would agree with this, I'm a little bit concerned that in our education system we're moving more towards teaching people what to think rather than how to think.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree.
And that bothers me the most. And by the way, I will admit that often churches do that as well. And I want to say, no, don't do that.
Yeah. I think that ultimately was what began to turn me off, at least, because it would be, you would ask a question and they say, well, God is always good, and you think, well, but that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense in my experience. And I value the fact that your book is trying as much as possible, because obviously it is written for people in a Christian context, and I definitely got that because it kind of comes from a predisposition, or presupposes that they already believe in God, if that makes sense.
And it presupposes that the Bible is the Word of God. And I would argue about that. That's why the first three tend to be on that issue. But what I'm trying to do is say, do you know this? The Bible's not a manual that says, here's your question. And I'm certainly not a spiritual Google or, ask Alexa instead of ask Dave and he'll give you the right answer. No, I won't. Because all of these questions, I had to seriously sit down and really, they're all genuine questions. Not one of them's made up. Not one of them comes from a youth leader.
And you can kind of tell the way they're phrased that actually is coming from someone who is doing their exams or has this particular situation going on in their lives. And I like that there's a kind of real kind of, you don't feel like these are sort of carefully constructed questions. They're just the questions young people ask. Would this book, having had a chance to look at it, and kind of in any way have helped you, do you think, when you were at that stage of asking these kinds of questions?
Sure. I think, and I'll be honest, when I was beginning to question, and my dad realised that I was beginning to question, and perhaps not having questions that were perhaps the right questions, and
how can I be saved?
Things like that. It was sort of like, well, why is the problem of evil, I think, was the biggest question for me when I was younger, so Dad handed me a lot of these kinds of books, and the Shack as well. I remember, like things about faith being rocked and all that sort of stuff. And and I love. I mean, I've gone on to study theology at university. I love reading books about religion and stuff. So obviously, I read those as well. And you're right. Some of the books were obviously trying to give you the answers, which I think as young people, actually, you kind of. It's particularly at sort of 15, 16, 17, you're in some way testing authority already. So to be told what to think actually is sometimes a turn off. And I think in some ways the book is helpful. And I like the foreword, where you say, this isn't to give you the answers, this is to help you to ask the questions. I do think that at some points in the book it does kind of give the answers in some way, rather than say, well, what do you think about the Bible, or what do you think about God? It kind of says, the Bible is the word of God.
Yeah, so it assumes a certain kind of.
It assumes that.
That's fair enough.
And I think that perhaps I might have rejected that as a young person, and certainly now I would encourage young people to, and I think you're agreeing with me on the sense that the more critical somebody can be, and whether they come to the conclusion that Christianity is correct, or whether they come to the conclusion that they would want to adopt a humanist worldview or whatever worldview, that they should be learning how to think, not what to think. And I do often think that these kinds of books give the answers, and don't necessarily give the question, because there are prayers at the end, right?
And that's why I wouldn't put that for non-Christians. However, one of the things with the prayers is, you say, I'm a Christian, but I'm not very sure. I'm beginning to doubt this. And say, well, okay, ask God.
Sure.
And the other thing, Justin knows me well enough to know that, of course, I'm going to say things that are, what? You can, and a bit assertive and so on.
Yes.
But that's why at the end of every chapter I've got the consider bit. So that genuinely is consider, and it's not.
I like that it's got references to go and read up about this, and do you agree with this or do you not? And I absolutely, I think that that's a better way to write a book.
And the other thing I want is basically I want young people who are growing up in Christian homes or whatever, whether they profess to be Christian or not. I mean, and just growing up in a Christian home doesn't make you a Christian.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I want them at least to be able to think for themselves, so that when they get to university and meet the Humanist Society, they can go, oh, it's all right, I've been there, done that.
Sure.
You know?
I know what you mean. You don't want them to only start thinking about these questions once they basically leave the church and go into. You want, in some sense, for there to be an opportunity to engage those questions at an early stage. By the way, I love the design.
Yeah.
This looks fabulous.
It's very nice, yeah.
But obviously the chapters themselves are very short. You know, you're tackling over 50 questions there, and it's not a very long book. So you've kind of had to inevitably distill this stuff down.
Yeah.
And I suppose the way you're answering questions is going to be different to, say, if you were addressing a more academic audience or an older audience. And to some extent, though, I think that's helpful, because I think it's harder to get away with fudging or glossing over things with a young audience, where you just use a sort of slightly fancy theological term.
Yeah. Well, on the one hand this, and on the other hand that, and on the other hand this. And then, can I explain about the design? Because I love the design. It's a guy called Al McInnes, and it was quite funny because it's pink and blue with a hand.
Yeah.
And the hand is actually his hand. It's a biometric image of his
lovely.
hand. And that's because these questions came from young people all over the world, 21 different countries. And, you know, it's funny, creation evolution wasn't asked once.
Really?
The suffering question was largely only asked from Western countries, which was fascinating.
That's an interesting thing.
But
yeah.
every single country asked about gender and identity.
Right.
So, your hand is unique. And so the biometric thing, nobody's got your fingerprints. So it was that. Plus, I mean, the publishers actually they said, we don't, pink and blue, what's that? You know,
Right.
Can we have it red? And I said, no, you're not having the red hand of Ulster on my finger. I ain't going that route, you know, for those who know that particular tradition. And you know, and again, the pink and blue, the identity. Identity is such a huge question for young people today. Much more than it was when I was a younger person.
And hence why, in a sense, we need to know the actual questions our young people are asking, rather than assume that it's necessarily the same questions as an older generation.
Yeah.
Let's go to some questions. And just a reminder, if you're listening and you would like to get involved, you can email in your thoughts about today's show. Do that via unbelievable@premier.org.uk. You can also find us online via the social media @unbelievablejb to tweet me, facebook.com/unbelievablejb for the Facebook page. All of those links and today's show links to my guests from the webpage too, premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. So why don't we go to some of the questions that I managed to get out of some of our young people, and feel free to obviously draw in other parts of the book as we go. Why don't we first of all hear from, we're going to hear first of all from Sam and Libby.
How was God created?
That's an interesting one. Why would you want to ask that question?
Because God created heaven and earth, and there was no one to create him.
I wonder about how he's always lived and how he hasn't been born or anything.
It's a great question. Do you think there's an answer to it?
Well, I think that God is he can do anything, and he was just always there because he has no start and no end.
Oh, she's answered it.
So that was Libby, and before her Sam, asking very similar questions. Who created? It's kind of like, it is your classic.
It's a classic
sort of question. So yes, you thought Libby did a good job at the end there anyway, David. What is that the kind of response you would give to that question?
Yeah, because the question when it's asked by teenagers is a great question. When it's asked by Richard Dawkins, I want to bang my head off a wall. Because he clearly hadn't studied theology or philosophy or anything. Because the question doesn't make any sense. It's like asking, how is a circle square? Well, it's not. So nobody believes in a created God. Christians don't believe in a created God. We believe in an uncreated God. We believe in an eternal being. And therefore, the question itself, if you were, further on, if you like, asking I think for a teenager to ask it, it's just simply saying, actually, we believe that God has no beginning and no end. Now, what that then comes down to, well, okay, how is that possible? And I think part of the problem is they have an image in their head of God being just like a super us.
Yeah.
And we all have a beginning and an ending, you know. And
God is just another thing in the universe of objects, if you like.
So,
just a very sort of special, powerful thing.
Yeah, so I would then tend to go, and I'd be interested to know what Hannah thinks of this, because my problem was, when I was desperately trying to be an atheist as a teenager, because I just thought it'd be so cool, intellectually, I just couldn't get there. And the main problem was this one, actually. I either had to believe in uncreated matter, eternal matter, out of which my mind and other people's minds came. And even Einstein couldn't go that far. I mean, he did believe that there was a mind behind the whole universe. He certainly wasn't a Christian. Or I had to believe that everything was created out of nothing, which by itself, at no point in time, somehow it all created itself out of nothing. You know,
so that very fundamental kind of philosophical question.
So I was stuck.
Why is there something rather than nothing?
Yeah,
felt like it had had a natural answer.
Yeah.
I mean, you must have kind of pondered this sort of a question at some point, Hannah. So what's been your response to these sorts of issues?
I think the answer really is, I mean, obviously I don't believe in God, but and the answer beyond the Big Bang, we really don't know what happened. And I think it's actually disingenuous and somewhat the God of the gaps type of argument to try and argue that we know what was there before the Big Bang. We just don't know. And the reason I'm an atheist is that there is no evidence for what happened before the Big Bang. We just don't know, and we can't say that was God, and we can't say that wasn't God.
Do you think that the question itself, if you like, is a valid one? Because obviously the way David answers it is to say, well, it's about how you define God, and God, by definition, is uncreated. Is that a satisfactory answer to the question of, well, if God did create things, who created God, sort of thing?
I wouldn't say, I mean, obviously that's what Christians believe. I don't think it is satisfactory, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad question to ask even as an adult. I think if you look at the universe and you say, well, it's so complex and it's so beautiful, and I mean, I wouldn't necessarily agree that it was all, I mean, it's beautiful in sometimes a very horrifying way. But the complexity of the universe, if we think about how complex the universe is, surely God have to be much more complex. And we argue that the universe must have been created. It has to have been created because it's so complex and so intelligently designed, or it seems so. So a being that is more complex than the universe, more complex than we can ever consider, surely if you're going by that logic of the fact that the universe had to be created, and sure, the universe is in a natural state and God is supernatural,
that being itself needs an explanation.
Absolutely. Right.
And you've explained one thing with another unexplained thing.
Absolutely.
And this actually sounds very like what Richard Dawkins essentially says in The God Delusion. He makes this sort of claim that if you're going to explain a complex thing like the universe with another thing like God, then
the answer isn't simple.
He would say that's an even more complex explanation.
Absolutely.
So what's your response to that sort of lie?
My old friend Richard Dawkins, I would say that he does just exactly what you've done, which is evoke science of the gaps, which is basically saying, well, we don't know, but one day science will discover. And what Dawkins does in The God Delusion, he goes to the lengths of the absurd. So he's forced, because of the complexity of the universe and the fine-tuning argument, to accept the multiverse argument. And when I read it, first of all, in his book, I burst out laughing because I thought he was joking, and then I realized he was serious. He's saying there are other universes, one of which you exist in, you're already dead, another in which you exist and you have a green moustache. And I look at that and I burst out laughing. I thought you weren't being serious, but he was.
When it comes to those kinds of it is that kind of postulation, is that the right word?
Yeah.
Is
speculation.
Speculation. There we go. Okay, is simply that. And I don't think Richard Dawkins. I mean, it's potentially more mathematically provable that may be a thing that happens, but I don't think Richard Dawkins would say we know that we have the multiverse.
No, but he was saying perhaps this would be that, and there's a reason he has to do that, and that is because of the complexity. But you're also presupposing something there, that a complex universe assumes a more complex God. I don't accept that.
Okay.
So I think there's a Roman Catholic theologian, Keith Ward, who's also wrote against Dawkins. He talks about the simplicity of God, and that's a classic Christian doctrine. Simplicity being used not in the sense of unintelligent, but actually not complex in the way that we might see the universe as being. But you see, my problem is, and I would say this to young people as well, because this is where I was really, really stuck. I came to believe that the Big Bang was right and that the universe had a beginning, that matter was not eternal.
Sure.
And if something has a beginning, if you say who made God, and they have to be more complex, then who made the person who made God, and then who made... So it's like turtles all the way down.
You get the infinite regress.
Yeah, so you get that. I just don't believe in an infinite regress. That doesn't make sense. And so
you would simply go to that, again, it's an age-old philosophical argument that you have to have, as it were, a prime mover. That for there to be anything now, you have to have a beginning point, and that beginning point itself obviously cannot have another beginning point. And God is the best explanation for what that beginning would look like.
Well, it's Lennox's great question at the end of his book about God and science and religion and science. Has science killed off God and so on? Where he says we're left fundamentally with two choices. Either your mind comes from uncreated matter, or it comes from a greater mind.
One quick response, then we'll go to our next question.
I think really, again, it comes back to what I said at the beginning. We just don't know. And I do genuinely think, sure, you could. So, and in your book, you say, does science prove God or disprove God or whatever? And you say, well, yes and no. And I think that you can say, well, this points in this direction, but and to me, deism may make more sense. That is like the belief in a creator God, but maybe a God that is no longer present in the universe.
Right.
And however, I just don't accept that there is a simple answer to that, and that answer is God. And I don't know, and I don't think that science will ever know what happened before the Big Bang. Maybe it will. Maybe we'll get to a point where we can discover something outside of our own universe. But until that point,
even if we did get to that, it would still leave that question of why is there that thing? Why is there that thing?
Absolutely.
I mean, so it's one of those questions that could ultimately, you do get the infinite regress even if you get some sort of physical explanation.
I mean, I really like what you say, because it's so different from Peter Atkins, who says, one day science will prove everything, show everything. You're clearly accepting there are questions we're not. And I would say the same. I think the difference between us is this: I agree with you unless it was revealed to us. So also, I believe in revelation, and I believe that. So. And then that ultimately, for me, everything does come down to Jesus Christ. But we shall come onto that, I'm sure.
We have to go to our first break already, I'm afraid. But we've got more questions coming up from Oliver, from Matthew, from Jack, from Noah, if we can get time. So we will take a quick break, and we'll be back in a short moment as my humanist guest, Hannah, and my Christian guest, David Robertson, respond to young people's questions on today's special edition of Unbelievable. For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter. Welcome back to today's programme, Humanist and Christian, responding to young people's questions about God. David Robertson and Hannah Timson join me on the show today. David Robertson has a new book out, ASK, Real World Questions, Real World Answers. Over 50 questions from young people all over the world. And we're going to be hearing across the course of the rest of the show today more of these questions that have come in that I filmed with some of the young people down at my local church. Hannah Timson responding as an atheist, non-Christian on today's show, and is emeritus, I was about to say professor, president.
You've been promoted.
Emeritus president of Humanist Students UK. Look, why don't we dive straight into another question from one of our young people. And this is Oliver, who has a question about prayer.
How does he handle with all of the dreams and wishes and things?
Okay, and I suppose that could be like prayers as well.
Yeah, prayers.
Yeah. What makes you kind of confused about how God would even handle that?
Because there are so many believers and so many pray every day. So how could he handle with all of that? How can he answer every single one of them?
Yeah.
Does he have the knowledge for all of the questions? Because some of them must be difficult to answer.
Yeah. Do you ever pray yourself?
Yeah, I pray a lot.
Okay.
Great question.
So, Oliver is wanting to know about prayer. I'll start again with you, David, and then we'll cross to Hannah. Did you get many questions on prayer from
Yeah,
people?
in fact, I'm just looking up just now. I've got 2 or 3 in chapter 39, 40, and 41. But 39 was, who can I ask for help before an exam or any other situation? God the Father, the Son, of the Holy Spirit.
There's many non-Christians who probably ask the same question ahead of an exam. But yeah,
do they divide up the work? And I understand where the question's coming from, because I think my answer would be, well, how did Google do it? And it's back. I mean, the first question was really about the eternity of God. This one is about, to use the technical language, the omniscience of God, God knowing everything. I think the harder part of that question is not so much to see God as a kind of spiritual Google, but how can he individually? So Jesus, for example, saying there's not a hair falls from your head. Well, for me, that's not a big deal, but for other people, there's a lot of hairs. And I think it's how can an almighty, omniscient God be personal? But, I mean, the answer to his question would simply be, well, God is omniscient and knows everything. But it's that, how do you have that personal connection? And again, that brings me back to Jesus.
I suppose, I mean, I don't know if you remember the film Bruce Almighty, where Jim Carrey plays Bruce and has to do God's job for a weekend. And one of the scenes is where he sort of has all of the prayer requests coming in, and sort of he gets them on post-it notes, and they flood his whole house, and then he just gets them all via email, and he just says auto reply yes to everything, and of course everything goes wrong, because if you answer everyone's prayer chaos ensues. And I think there's something about that idea in what Oliver's asking, which is, how can God answer all prayers to everyone's satisfaction? Because everyone's praying different things, and things will contradict each other, and so in that kind of scenario, how do you anticipate God's going to respond? If
well, because it's the difference between seeing prayer as God being a divine slot machine that you put your prayer in and out comes what you want, which I'm praying that Scotland will beat England. And then there's a lot of English people praying. Well, the prayer of a Scotsman is much more efficacious, powerful. But that's not prayer. Prayer is relational.
Okay.
So, I mean, the standard thing is, with prayer, God will sometimes say yes, sometimes say no, sometimes say wait, and it's a relational thing, and how all that fits in. I mean, I think his question's a great question. And I think questions about prayer are very, very real. But the first thing is to move away from the slot machine. I put my prayer in, God's going to answer it.
What do you think about the prayer question?
So I kind of, for a long time, I often thought that prayer was a very useful thing for Christians. Yeah. And I always used to have sort of conversations with my friends about prayer. And, they spend time going to prayer meetings, et cetera, et cetera. And then it kind of dawned on me, maybe a couple of years ago, actually, really, because slowly the sort of the things that I used to think are kind of becoming, unraveling. I sort of thought, well, what's the point of prayer, right? So if God has a plan for your life, and maybe you're answering this in the book, if God
carry on,
if God has a plan for your life, if God already knows what's going to happen before you've done it, if it's God's way or your own way. It seems bizarre to me to ask God for anything.
If it's already kind of...
Well, is God going to change his mind?
Right, yeah,
is God susceptible to the whims of human beings? And I can understand prayer on a relational perspective. If you think that you're talking to God, I personally think that when you pray or when you meditate, you're talking to yourself, and that's not necessarily a negative thing.
So and even I know even non-Christians who don't believe in God who would still say absolutely prayer can have beneficial effects.
I think so.
So that's not necessarily a question. It's more the kind of, but how would it, if God does exist,
why would it
how
work
would that
like
actually
that?
Work? What does it change his mind? Surely, if God's omnipotent, sovereign, he doesn't. It's not like he's changing his mind every 20 seconds when he receives a new prayer. Yeah. Okay. So again, classic questions in a sense about prayer, and I think you do actually tackle that very sort of issue.
do. So I have a book with a question here. This was, why pray about things is question 40. If God has already planned what's going to happen, what's the point? And I'll not read the whole answer. You have to get that yourself. But basically, it's, I argue that fatalism is not a Christian attribute. So it's not que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. Even if you're a Calvinist, and you've had that discussion a few times on this program. And I think there's a balance. There's a balance on the one hand, some people so stress the sovereignty of God that they think, well, what's the point of doing anything? And on the other hand, people say, if only I pray enough, I'm sure you've come across this.
Oh, a lot.
If I do 24/7 prayer, then I'm bound to get the answer, as though we can nag God into giving us what we want.
And that makes me feel like God is, I don't know, not as powerful as perhaps he is, and he's at the whim of humanity.
He's going to have to listen to me. Hey, my arguments are brilliant. You better line up with this one. And, but
so where do you draw the line then between those two kind of extremes?
Well, I would say when the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Lord, teach us how to pray," and I'm going, "Duh, you idiots! Everyone knows how to pray." No, we don't. Mm-hmm. So I would say that I'll quote from the book: a much more balanced and Christian perspective is to pray to a sovereign God who, in His sovereignty, has asked us to pray and has promised that He hears the prayers of His people. So I would say that it is a relational thing. The emphasis is on the relational. I would say in my life, I've seen direct, specific answers to prayer that are to me are inexplicable, other than being direct. But I would say that they are very rare.
Right.
I would say that much more has happened in terms of prayer being relational. So as you know, Justin, I was seriously ill in 2011, and I think the most extraordinary example of faith I've ever come across is my son, who, when I was lying in a coma, he wrote on a Facebook post, "I've just been with my sister to see my dad, probably for the last time. We're praying that he gets better, but if he doesn't get better, our prayers have already been answered because my dad's greatest problem, his sin, has been dealt with. And if he gets better, that's an answer to prayer, and if he doesn't get better, it's an answer to prayer." And I remember saying that once at a conference of the British Science Association, I think it was called, way up in the north. And I remember a scientist standing up afterwards and saying, "So you're saying that if you died, that's God answering prayer, and if you live, that's God answering prayer?" And I said, "Yes." He says, "That's not fair. God wins every time." I said, "Yeah, God wins every time." I said, "That's the point."
What do you think of that idea?
I mean, it's not exactly. Again, if God is in control of everything and knows what's going to happen, then of course God is prayer is always being answered, and God is always doing what is right for you, right?
Right for Him, I think.
Oh, right for Him,
which ultimately becomes right for me.
Okay, yeah, agreed.
So that's what I would say.
But I obviously think that prayer is. So I remember every morning the Amish would get up, and some families still do this, I think in America anyway, and they would have a prayer session and they would read the Bible together, and actually it was a very good way of connecting the family to each other. And they would pray for things, and they would pray for their community and their neighbours, and absolutely that's a wonderful way to start the day, I think. Even if I wake up every morning and I don't pray, but I think about all the things that I'm grateful for and all the things that are going right and going wrong. And you're saying that Christians don't have a kind of que sera, sera attitude, but in that situation it does definitely sound like a whatever will be, because it's saying, well, if he dies, then God's won, and if he doesn't, then God's also won. And that definitely, I agree with, it's a bit unfair. It does seem a bit que sera, sera.
Well, it seems, you see, que sera, sera would be, we're not going to bother praying, because if he's going to die, he's going to die. So whereas they're saying, "Lord, we want you to do this," and God hears the cries of His people. And ultimately, I mean, I had a colleague at the same time who was ill. He was supposed to get better. I was supposed to die. He died. And in fact, at that meeting I told you about with the scientist, his widow was present. And she came up afterwards and just said, "Thank you so much." Her husband had died, she said to me, it was the right time for him to go. And I think that's where the faith and trust comes in. But I'm intrigued, Hannah, because you wake up and you feel grateful, but to whom?
For existence, for all the people in my life that have that look after me, for all of the good things. That doesn't mean that I'm grateful to God. I could be living in a country where I don't have any food, where I'm suffering every day, and I'm not. And maybe I've won the lottery of life in some regards, but that doesn't necessarily mean that God has blessed me. Has God not blessed those people in countries where they suffer?
This sort of leads us into the next question quite neatly. Matthew has a question. Let's hear his one.
My difficult question is, why do we have gratuitous evil if we're not actually learning or improving off of it?
Okay, so this is one of those big questions about pain and suffering and evil, and you can maybe understand that in some circumstances, things that happen, things we do wrong, we can kind of take away some lesson and we can improve from it. But when you say gratuitous evil, what do you mean by that?
So things we don't learn from, a bit like paper cuts, say, you're not taking away any lessons from it, you're not improving off it, it's not teaching you anything.
So it just seems like there's some things that happen where you can't see any rhyme or reason or lesson behind it.
Yeah.
And I suppose that could be really big things as well.
Yeah, like the Holocaust even.
Do you think of that as something like a gratuitous evil?
Yeah, I do, because it's not teaching us anything. Like, it's just pure evil. We're killing innocent lives.
So that was Matthew, and in a sense, it kind of flows, as we said, from your question. Well, if God does bless some people and answer prayers, why do so many prayers not go answered? And Matthew, uses this specific word, gratuitous evil. I think he recognises there's an argument that some kind of pain and suffering can help us grow, and there might be some purpose we can recognise. But Matthew also seems to be saying there's some things that just don't seem to you can't give a defence in that way, because they just seem so utterly terrible and horrible, and how could we possibly speak of there being some purpose behind it? So yeah, that's a tough one, Dave. So what's your response?
I thought you'd go to Hannah first on that one. Well, as you know, I've looked at this many times. In fact, I went to university to study this question, but the Holocaust in particular. And what was fascinating, I mean, you picked up on there, is his word gratuitous, which I think, that's where I'd want to dig in. Also, the concept of evil. How do we know that something is evil? So, I mean, I've been to Auschwitz, and you stand at the gates, and not so much Auschwitz as Belsen. It's the industrial scale of Belsen that's just unreal. Remove God from the equation, you've still got Belsen. So, are you just saying, well, that's the way? I mean, Hannah was saying it's the lottery. That some people win, some people lose. That's just the way of it. I think if you're going to accept the concept of evil, I mean, Dawkins says the universe basically has all the properties that we'd expect if there was no good and evil. So good and evil are just human things made up, social constructs, etc., etc. I don't believe that. I believe there is such a thing as evil. So I then looked for the answer for evil. I also think the key thing in his question is gratuitous. How do you know if it's gratuitous or not?
Right.
And I think we then have to say, again, what Hannah was saying earlier, there are limits to our knowledge, and I think there are limits to our knowledge of morality and so on. We're like, the story of Corrie ten Boom in The Hiding Place. Well, I visited her house, and there's a tapestry there. And I think on one side, you look at the tapestry, it's just a mess. And then you turn it round, and if I remember rightly, it's all things work together for the good of those who love God. I think that's the verse. I may be wrong, because I'm speaking from memory. But one side, the pattern looks horrendous. It looks a mess. And the other side, you see there's beauty comes to the purpose.
Right.
And so I think...
And she obviously was someone who experienced the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps.
She experienced that incredible evil.
Yeah.
The more I go on in life, the more I see there's just some unbelievable evil. I want to know what the answer is to it. And it seems to me we're left with two answers. One is there actually is no purpose, no meaning. We just have to suck it up, suckers. Which, hardcore, like really hardcore. New fundamentalist atheists, as I call my friends, and that's not you, Hannah, because you've still got a residue of Christianity in you, which we want to bring back.
Well.
Anyway, we'll let you answer.
But yeah, so for you, okay, difficult question, but ultimately, you'd rather have the mystery of suffering in a God who will ultimately make some sense of it than the meaninglessness that you see in the face of suffering that otherwise. And
also, I would see all suffering in the light of the cross.
Right.
So there was an old Scots preacher who said, "There is no pit so deep that Christ has not gone deeper still." And so when I'm meeting with people, I mean, I'll just tell you one story to illustrate that. I mentioned the illness, and I was asked to go and speak about it, which I didn't often do, in a housing scheme, and I spoke, and this lady came up to me afterwards, and she said, "David, my partner died of a brain tumour. I have a brain tumour. I've got 3 daughters who are going wild. I live in this dump. I can't get a job. I can't go to hospital." And I said, "Life's pretty ugly." And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, I can't heal you. I can't offer you all the things that you want. But I can offer you someone who takes the ugliest thing and can make it beautiful." And she just burst into tears and said, "If only that were true." And I said, "Well, that's the crux of it, isn't it? I believe Jesus can do that."
Hannah, what do you make of this question? I mean, this was one you debated at length, obviously, last time you came in with Sharon Dirks anyway. But do you, I mean, maybe to respond to David's view that you don't lose the problem of evil by becoming an atheist, it just becomes a kind of a meaningless fact of existence? What I mean, is that the way you see it or not?
I think in some ways, actually adding God into the equation makes the question all the more complicated,
Right.
and actually you're implicating God in that evil, because God, at least by Christian definitions, is all-powerful, all-knowing, and in the first question I remember asking that kind of had raised a few eyebrows at church was, well, if evil exists and good exists, then why isn't God both good and evil? And if God allows the terrible things to happen, if God created the devil, if you believe in the devil, and allowed him to fall and knew that he was going to fall and knew that mankind was going to fall, and maybe we'll come back to the question of original sin, because I actually find that theology actually pretty abhorrent, particularly when it comes to children. If God allowed all of that stuff to happen, and if that's what you believe, then God implicated that evil and allowed you to suffer, and instead of, and I think there will be a question later about why didn't he just create us in heaven,
Right?
And
it feels like why do we have to? Was it worth it? I suppose creating us with this, this world in which we would experience suffering, evil, pain.
What's the point?
And God didn't have to do that, yet He did, and it doesn't seem to remove a lot of the suffering that does exist when He potentially could.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it actually makes more sense to me to believe in a universe that has that doesn't care about me specifically, and that all the meaning that I create, all the meaning that exists in the world is something that I create, and I create with my fellow beings in society. And actually, my life is pretty meaningless. And I know that that's a terrible thing for people to hear, and I think that people don't. That's quite difficult as human beings, because we like to think of ourselves as something special, and we are special to ourselves, and we have a large, a vast control of the world, and I don't think we have control of the universe. The universe is more vast than we can even imagine. So the idea that we are somewhat special, and the idea that good and evil simply is a universal thing for the entirety of the universe, and that Jesus came to die for us on this small planet. And people say, well, isn't that wonderful? Isn't that incredible? And I think that just shows the anthropocentric nature of Christianity and of a lot of Abrahamic faiths, and I really struggle with that in particular.
Yeah.
Why does the universe care? Why does God care?
Yeah.
Well, okay. Let me try and answer that, because I think, as regards the evil thing and creation, I cite in the book Augustine's argument, which for me was very convincing. God created all things. Mm-hmm. Evil is not a created thing; it's the absence of good. God did not create evil, but permits it for the good. Now you say, why did He do that? Well, again, with young people, what I'd often do is this. I would say, if I could create a world in which you experience no angst, no suffering, no pain, no broken relationships, would you want that world? I'd say, yeah, okay, I'm going to create a world in which you're a chair. Well, hang on a minute, that's not what I want. I want to be able to love, I want to be able to, but can you have the light without the darkness? Can you have the good without the bad? And it's not the what they call the Manichaean heresy that there's a good God and a bad God. It's that God permitted evil. And I think the most telling thing about what you've said is, because it's an honest thing, is ultimately in this universe it's meaningless. So the book in the Bible, Ecclesiastes, I regard that as the best book to preach the gospel from to today's 21st century young people, because it starts off with everything's meaningless. And I think most young people at some point feel that. And I think to construct a meaning for yourself is a house of cards. It's a false one. It's a false meaning.
That's precisely what you've been advocating,
Sure.
and humanists advocate is that, okay, there is no big overarching meaning. We're not here for some grand purpose. Mm-hmm. We're not part of some grand narrative. But I can still have meaning, and it's my personal meaning that I invest.
Sure, and a societal meaning, and in some ways, if you want to look at, we talk a lot about common good, and Christians talk a lot about common good. If you want to look at the world on a global scale, and we look at things like the EU and the things that we've created to try and overcome great evils like war, and try to tackle things like famine, etc., etc. Human beings have created that meaning together, and sure, there's personal meaning, and then there's also something that's more more universal, but that doesn't mean that meaning is the ultimate truth or the ultimate goodness. And obviously we'll talk about, because obviously you believe in, I imagine, in divine command theory, and that the truth and knowledge and morality comes from God, whereas I would say it comes from the bottom upwards, perhaps. I don't necessarily think that the fact that there is no, or we can't be certain of any ultimate meaning makes life less interesting, because we do place value on ourselves just simply by the fact that we're alive and that we experience, that we're conscious. And of course, I wouldn't want to be a chair because I have no knowledge of what that means to be a chair. I have no way of comprehending what it would be like to be an unconscious being. But perhaps if I was a chair, I wouldn't know, so I wouldn't care.
Would you like to be a human who lives life without any kind of pain or suffering or challenges of any kind in your life, I suppose, is perhaps
I think that's, for me, as somebody who doesn't believe in God, I think that is what it means to be human, that we do struggle and we do suffer, and that ultimately that's just the way of the world and that's just the way of the universe, and that's just part of being in an uncaring universe. However, if there is a God, then I think he'd have to be...
You should have done a better job at...
Absolutely.
Right. Quick response, David, and then we're going to go to our final question.
Yeah, very quick. I think the only way... there are things that God cannot do. So he can't create a square circle. When we say God is all-powerful, he can't lie. He can't do things that are inconsistent with his own nature. And one of the things that he cannot do is create human beings who freely love him when the only option he gives them is to love him, because then that's not freely loving him. And so therefore, I would argue that it may be... William Lane Craig calls this idea of the world as being a place for soul making. That this is how we learn. We learn through suffering. We learn through many things. We learn to call upon God. But to me, your situation, what you've described, how could you condemn somebody who found that being a Nazi gave them meaning and purpose in their lives? Everyone constructs their own meaning. There is no absolute meaning or absolute truth. And your situation, whilst it sounds nice from your perspective, in reality ends up creating hell on earth, in my view. Every group identifies its meaning with that group, and these groups create chaos. You mentioned, for example, the EU. Some people regard the EU as nirvana, other people regard it as a totalitarian, authoritarian regime.
Sure.
We all create our own meaning, and therefore we end up with wars, we end up with everything else. We need a meaning from out with ourselves.
We're going to go to a break, and maybe we'll pick this up again, because we've got another question that sort of ties in with this anyway.
Sure.
But we are just at the end of the second part of today's show. We'll bring you the third and final part with a final question from Noah in a short moment's time. We're going to have to skip one of our questions for time, but maybe another time we can do Jack's Adam and Eve question, which is another fascinating one. Young people ask great questions, and that's what we're talking about on today's show, as I'm joined by David Robertson and Hannah Timson, as we look at some of the questions that some of the young people in my own church have been asking. And we'll be back in a short moment's time with the final part of today's show.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
We've just got one left, and it's from my own son, in fact, Noah. So let's hear what Noah had to ask about the nature of heaven.
I'd like to know what heaven is like.
Do you have any theories about what heaven is like?
I just think of it as like a perfect place where God is in every part of it and there's no pain or suffering. And it's like Earth but different, because I don't think it will be like the same dimension. Everything will work completely different and everything will look different, and I don't know if we'll look the same or not, or if we'll still be married or not, or what will happen, or if so I think everyone will be able to start again, I think, so yeah.
I've got another tough question for you then. If this place does exist, why didn't God just take us all there right now?
Well, that's the question I have. Why is Earth the first part? What is the purpose of Earth? Because if there's only two parts of life, Earth and heaven, then what is Earth for? And I don't really know that. I wouldn't be able to explain that.
There you go. That's Noah's question. What is the nature of heaven, and why aren't we just taken straight there, David? I think you've got a chapter that does deal with heaven.
Yeah, I've got two. One that deals with animals in heaven. Basically.
Oh yeah, which is another very common question.
It's a very common one. Those are two just massive questions in the very limited space and time that we have left. So I'll answer them, and then Hannah won't get a look in. No, I just think very, very briefly, I don't know what heaven's going to be like. I rely a lot on C.S. Lewis, I'm afraid, with particularly the last of the Narnia, the last battle, where you onwards and upwards. And I love his idea that here it's not the reality, we're living in the Shadowlands. So I've heard it explained to me when I was a young person, a young Christian, and I remember walking in the Highlands in Scotland beside a beach, the moon shining on the sea and all this kind of stuff, and saying to the guy who was with me, the old man who was with me, I don't want to leave this. I don't want to go to heaven and sit on a cloud playing a harp in an eternal church service. And he said, oh, David, you have so much to learn. And he just looked round and he said, David, everything that's here is in heaven, but 1,000 times better. And so I think of it that way, without the pain, without the suffering, and what Noah said was right. I think the second part of the question is, why are we here? Why don't we just go straight to heaven? So
why do we have to go through the pain and suffering bit first?
Yeah, exactly. So let's do some Latin. No, there's from a theological perspective, God created humanity perfect, good, but able to sin. We had the choice. We sinned. Now we've fallen. We're in an extent where we're not able not to sin. There's nobody who doesn't sin or do something. There's nobody that's perfect. When we become Christians, we're forgiven for our sins, but we are still able to sin, but we're forgiven for that. But when we get to heaven, we will have freely chosen God, but we will then be able not to sin. So it's as though we've gone through this whole process in order to be free creatures in a world which is perfect. If we were in a world in which we were able to sin, the world wouldn't be perfect. So I think that's the heavy answer to that question. There's something going on here that fits us for heaven. We determine our eternal destiny while we're on earth. And I think that's hard for human beings because we tend to think of the here and now as being the absolute. Whereas going back to the first part of the question, the Shadowlands, maybe this is not the be-all and end-all. Maybe there's something still to come. Maybe the best is yet to be.
Before you engage with that particular dimension of David's response, is the idea of an afterlife, something beyond this life, something you miss in any way, having lost your faith?
This is something that I think, because when I was a Christian, I remember having a conversation, I think the one atheist girl in my class at school, because I went to a Church of England school, actually just around the corner from here, but I remember asking her, like, what happens when you die? Like, and she said, well, I just die. And I just remember thinking, that's really sad. Yeah. And I don't think that now, absolutely not. I think in some way there is a beauty in a limited existence, and the idea that I know that this is all that I have, and so therefore I must focus on the here and now, and I must make the most of all of my friendships and relationships with people. I say must, I can choose not to. I can choose to be entirely nihilistic about it and live my life simply in a hedonistic way if I wanted to. But actually, for me, it is important to live to the best of my ability and to bring joy to people while I'm here. And actually there is a comfort in knowing that this pain, in a similar way to Christians, I suppose, that the pain and the suffering of the world will come to an end. But ultimately that I don't think that there will be a heaven afterwards. And I do think that again, with the anthropocentric nature of things, why is there a heaven? Why do we want a heaven? Because we want the idea that we'll see our loved ones again, or that we're afraid of dying. And I mean, maybe that's a very.
So do you think that's the reason why, in your view, we've sort of invented heaven, because we're scared of death, of the idea of loss, so heaven is a kind of convenient sort of way of giving us a sort of myth that we can.
Sure, and I don't
that takes away the sting of that.
This isn't offensive, but I do find that a lot of religion is trying to quell those fears and to have answers to questions that perhaps there aren't really bigger answers and bigger questions.
To
there must be more to
to
this, and there must be more meaning to our life.
Of death, the end.
Yeah. I don't think we have to accept it. Some people are like, for me, I have accepted that and come to terms with it. But I do think that there are non-religious people who are just as afraid of a death that is ultimately the ending. Rather than than beyond. I've come to terms with that, and I actually find that makes my life feel more beautiful and makes me feel like actually perhaps there's more responsibility right now, and that I won't be able to make that up.
We are drawing to the end, so I'll get you to respond to that, David, and then we'll start to have some final thoughts.
Okay,
draw things to a close.
That does make me very sad because two things. First of all, I think that because I believe in eternity and because I believe all human beings are eternal beings, then they've all to be treated with utmost respect and dignity and so on. And if I thought we were just dust returning to dust and that's it, then there's no logical reason for that to be the case. And if I create my own meaning, it's the same thing, there's the same problem. I think it's a little bit of a myth to say that heaven or hell is invented because we're scared of dying. I would say that we're scared of dying because of heaven and hell. I would reverse it completely. I would say that when I was trying to be an atheist, the thought of going into eternal nothingness was actually bliss. So I understand a little bit of what you're saying with that. But I just know that that's not true. I think in the words of Ecclesiastes 3, where it says, God has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what he has done from beginning to end. What a burden. Animals do not sit around wondering the meaning of life and what life after death and so on. Human beings do. And I don't think it's because we've just evolved to be more fearful. I think we have a sense of the eternal because there is a sense of because there is an eternal. And I think virtually all human beings within themselves have that awareness. And what's it John Lennox's thing about Christianity is a fairy story for those afraid of the dark, and his response was atheism is a fairy story for those afraid of the light.
Right, yes, that was so it was I think it was Hawking who said that phrase, heaven is and Christianity is a story for those afraid of the dark, and Lennox responded with I too little time to get into this, I'm afraid, and sorry we've again left such a big question right to the end, and I'm sure there's lots of things you'd like to say in response, Hannah. Maybe we can carry it on in some way in the future. But thank you both for being on today. Hannah, any final thoughts as we sort of draw this together? I guess whether you're a Christian or not, it's important that if we are in a church or not in a church, young people get the ability to ask these kinds of questions. Yes. And the saddest thing, I think, is churches where questions are kind of basically not allowed, or they're kind of shoved to the side. And I'm sure you would agree that whether if it's church or not a church, kids should be able to ask questions like this.
100%. I do struggle personally with ministering and evangelism that focuses on children. And I think you said at the beginning that there is you were saying there's a certain age that you sort of get children, if that makes sense, and draw them into the church. And actually, I think that is indoctrination.
Okay.
And that. Because you're getting them to ask questions within a framework where their authority figures believe a certain thing, and if you believe something else, then that's the devil tempting you away, or something like that. Then actually you're not giving them space to actually ask honest questions, because they're being frightened in some way into agreeing with their authority figures. I actually find it quite alarming when I see things like the Church of England spending millions and millions of pounds on drawing children into the church and focusing on evangelism towards children.
Because that for you looks like indoctrination.
Absolutely.
What's your response to that? I know we haven't really got time for this, but just quickly.
Okay, we'll need to do a whole programme on that. I mean, I would say that is why, of course, Richard Dawkins and the humanists want all our schools to, in effect, be secular schools, because they want to indoctrinate their own beliefs, and they want the questions asked within their framework of beliefs. So we all have presuppositions. I fully accept that. I mean, as we're drawing to a close, I mean, I do want to thank you, Hannah, for engaging so well and so kindly as well. You weren't nasty to me at all, which is lovely. Which, as someone said to me once, makes you even more dangerous. But no, I listened to your story. I hear what you're saying. I appreciate what you said, and we could have discussed these questions at a much deeper level as well. Yeah. I also appreciate the fact that you studied theology, which, to be honest, a lot of theology courses would put me off God as well. But I better not go there. That also is another program. But I would say this: my hope and my prayer is that God will change you and will bring you back. I don't think that my arguments or anyone's arguments can do that. I think it's only the Holy Spirit who can do that, and I think that's the advantage that we have as Christians. And of course, if the Holy Spirit doesn't exist, then you've nothing to worry about. But I mean, obviously I believe he does, and I believe that Jesus is the answer. But you're right, what I'm trying to do here is to get young people to think for themselves. If someone believes because I tell them to believe, it's not belief.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, it's been a very honest and constructive dialogue, I felt. So thank you very much, Hannah, David, for being with me on the show today.
Thank you very much.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.